I am 98 years old, and I am going to tell you the truth plain, before my voice gives out and before this world invents another foolish lie about how a man is supposed to stay alive. I have lived long enough to watch people go from cooking food in cast iron pans to heating fake meals in plastic trays. I have watched men who were strong as oak trees in their 40s become weak and swollen in their 60s because they handed their health over to advertisements, labels, and companies that never loved them. I have buried friends who thought medicine could outwork bad habits. I have listened to doctors younger than my shoes tell me what I ought to fear, and one by one I watched many of them disappear while I kept waking up in the morning, still breathing, still walking, still remembering my own name. Now I am not saying I know everything. A man who reaches 98 ought to be humble enough to know that only God knows everything. But I know what kept me here. I know what steadied my body through hard winters, hard work, grief, worry, and old age. And it was not some miracle powder in a shiny bottle. It was not a diet invented by a man in a suit trying to sell confusion back to hungry people. It was food, simple food, strong food, food that came from the earth, the water, the sun, and honest labor. Over a lifetime, I learned that the body does not ask for entertainment. It asks for nourishment. It asks for consistency. It asks for the same kind of faithfulness that a marriage asks for, or a farm, or a prayer life. I have eaten many things in my life, but there are 7 foods that stayed with me like old friends. 7 foods I return to again and again, not because somebody on the television told me to, but because my body answered them with strength. They fed my brain, my blood, my bones, my gut, my eyes, and that small hidden fire inside a man that tells him to rise in the morning and keep going. When I was young, I did not know the scientific names for half of what they were doing inside me. I just knew how I felt after eating them: clearer, stronger, steadier, less tired, less broken down by life. And now, at 98, I know enough to say this without flinching. These 7 foods are part of why I am still alive, not the whole reason. No, sir. A man also needs purpose. He needs work. He needs laughter. He needs somebody to love and something to believe in. But food is the fuel, and without good fuel, even a willing spirit has a hard time dragging a weak body across the years. So I will give you the list exactly as I lived it. No fancy nonsense. No polished marketing talk. Just the truth as I have known it in my own flesh. The first one is the same thing I have started my mornings with for most of my life: coffee. Good, black, strong coffee. Now let me tell you why that cup of black coffee became more than just a habit to me. It became a signal, a daily agreement between my body and my will. Every morning, before the noise of the world could get its hands on me, I would sit in the quiet with that rising steam in front of my face. I worked hard most of my life. Factory floors, loading docks, cold mornings where your breath looked like smoke from a tired engine. Coffee was not luxury, it was readiness. It sharpened my thoughts when sleep still clung to my eyelids. It warmed my chest when the air cut like glass. Years later, I heard people use big words like antioxidants and neuroprotection. All I knew was that after that first swallow, my mind stood up straight. But listen carefully. I never drowned it in sugar, never buried it under whipped cream and chemical syrup. I drank it plain, sometimes bitter enough to make your eyebrows tighten. That bitterness, I believe, trained my discipline. A man who can face a bitter cup first thing in the morning can face a bitter day with a steadier hand. And that steadiness over decades becomes survival. The second food that walked beside me was berries. We did not have nutrition charts pinned to the walls when I was a boy. We had seasons. When the bushes grew heavy with dark fruit, we filled our pockets until our fingers turned purple. Blueberries, blackberries, whatever the land was willing to give. They were sweet, yes, but not the kind of sweetness that leaves you shaking and hungry again an hour later. They satisfied something deeper. Even now, I eat a handful most days. Scientists talk about polyphenols and inflammation now. I talk about clear joints and a memory that still knows the sound of my mother's laughter. Third comes the gift from the water, fatty fish. Sardines were my steady companion long before salmon became fashionable. I would pry open a small tin at lunchtime, sitting on a wooden crate with grease under my fingernails and sun on the back of my neck. Those oily fillets were strength disguised as simplicity. Later in life, I learned about omega-3 fatty acids, about how the brain itself is built from delicate fats that must be renewed like the oil in a faithful machine. I did not need the lecture. I could feel it. My mood stayed level. My thoughts stayed organized. When other men my age began losing their words like loose coins falling through a hole in their pockets, mine still stayed close to me. Number 4 is the humble egg. I have heard people argue about eggs for as long as I can remember. One decade they are saints, the next they are villains. Meanwhile, I kept cracking them into a hot pan and eating them with gratitude. The yolk, golden and soft, always felt like concentrated life itself. A perfect package of protein, fat, and those quiet nutrients the body recognizes instantly. Choline for the brain, lutein for the eyes. I learned those names late in life, but the results showed up early. My vision held steady. My hands remained firm enough to write letters well into my 90s. Then there is red meat. Now, this is where many people start shifting in their chairs. They have been frightened by headlines and statistics without context. I am not talking about processed scraps or mystery patties cooked under fluorescent lights. I'm talking about real meat, beef from animals that walked in sunlight and chewed grass as they were meant to. When work was heavy and days were long, that meat rebuilt me. Iron to keep the blood rich, vitamin B12 to keep the nerves awake, carnitine to keep the muscles answering when I called on them. A body that labors honestly needs honest fuel in return. I have seen men try to live on convenience food and wonder why their strength slipped through their fingers like sand. Now the sixth food might sound strange if you grew up in a house where everything came sealed and sterile. Fermented foods. We did not call them that. We called them pickles in a jar on the cellar shelf. Sauerkraut packed down tight in a crock. Buttermilk that tasted sharp but clean. Those foods were alive in a way modern diets often are not. They carried armies of good bacteria that tended the inner garden of the gut. And let me tell you something I have learned after nearly a century. When your digestion is peaceful, your whole life becomes more peaceful. You sleep better. You think clearer. Even your temper improves. And finally, there is one more companion that surprised even me in how faithful it has been. Raw cacao, not candy bars wrapped in bright foil, not sugar masquerading as comfort. I mean the dark, bitter powder that smells like earth after rain. I began adding a small spoonful to my coffee decades ago, long before I understood why it made me feel quietly alert. Later, I heard talk of flavonoids, of mitochondrial support, of tiny cellular engines being encouraged to renew themselves. All I knew was that it lit a small, steady fire inside my chest that never felt frantic or false. So there you have the list as it unfolded across my years: coffee, berries, fatty fish, eggs, red meat, fermented foods, and raw cacao. 7 simple allies. 7 daily decisions repeated so many times they became the rhythm of my existence. But do not make the mistake of thinking food alone writes the whole story of a long life. No. Food is the foundation, but a house still needs walls, windows, and a reason for someone to keep the lights on. If you are ready, I will tell you what else carried me this far. The habits, the losses, the stubborn faith that food alone could never replace. You see, a long life is not built only at the table. It is built in the quiet decisions nobody applauds. It is built in the moments when you are tired enough to quit, but choose to keep moving anyway. Those 7 foods strengthened my body, yes, but they would have meant very little if I had not also learned how to live inside that body with some sense and discipline. I have watched men eat well and still collapse under the weight of worry. I have watched others survive on simple meals but stand tall because their spirit had direction. Somewhere along the road, I understood that survival is a partnership between flesh and will. Work was my first teacher. Hard, steady work. Not glamorous work that makes headlines, but the kind that leaves your hands rough and your back honest. For 40 years I rose before sunrise and returned home after the light had already begun to fade. That rhythm kept my metabolism alive long before I ever heard such a word. It kept my muscles talking to my bones. It kept my lungs expanding fully, drawing in air like a bellows feeding a stubborn fire. Modern people sit too much. They sit while eating, sit while traveling, sit while thinking about exercising. A body was not designed to be parked like a broken vehicle. It was meant to move, strain, lift, bend, reach. Movement, repeated across decades, becomes medicine stronger than most prescriptions. Sleep was another quiet ally. I did not always get enough of it, especially in the years when responsibility pressed down like a heavy hand on my shoulders. But I respected it. When night came, I did not fight it with glowing screens or endless noise. I let darkness do its work. The body repairs itself in ways we still barely understand. Hormones settle, inflammation softens, memory organizes itself like papers filed in the right drawer. When you rob yourself of rest year after year, you are not cheating time. You are feeding chaos inside your own cells. At 98, I still guard my sleep like a farmer guards his final harvest before winter. Grief, of course, visited me more than once. A long life guarantees that. I lost people who were pieces of my own identity. For a time after my wife passed, food lost its taste. Even coffee seemed like colored water. That is when I learned that nourishment is not only physical. I had to relearn laughter, relearn conversation, relearn the simple act of stepping outside and feeling sunlight on my face. Loneliness can age a man faster than any disease. So I made a rule for myself: never close the door completely on the world. Even when sorrow sits beside you at the table, leave a chair open for hope. Faith also played its part, not in a loud or performative way, but in the steady belief that my days still had purpose. When you believe your life matters, you treat your body differently. You feed it with intention. You move it with gratitude. You forgive its aches because you understand it has carried you faithfully. I have seen bitterness hollow men out from the inside like termites in old wood. They eat and eat, but nothing seems to strengthen them because resentment poisons every swallow. Forgiveness, on the other hand, lightens the load the heart must carry, and a lighter heart often leads to a longer road. Curiosity kept my mind from stiffening like an unused joint. Even in my 80s and 90s, I read newspapers, listened to younger people explain new inventions, asked questions that made them smile politely. Learning is exercise for the brain. Just as muscles shrink without use, so does imagination. I practiced remembering names, telling stories, recalling dates. Memory is not only a gift, it is a skill that responds to attention. Those berries and fish may have fed my neurons, but curiosity kept them firing. And then there was moderation, that unfashionable word nobody wants to hear. I enjoyed my meals, yes. I respected red meat and eggs and strong coffee, but I did not drown in excess. I stopped eating when my hunger quieted. I drank water. I walked after supper. The body appreciates balance far more than extremes. I have watched men swing from indulgence to deprivation like a pendulum, exhausting themselves with each new promise of perfection. Longevity, in my experience, is quieter than that. It grows from consistency, from choosing the steady path over the dramatic one. So understand this clearly. Those 7 foods were tools. Powerful tools, yes, but still tools. What I built with them depended on my habits, my mindset, my willingness to endure discomfort without surrendering to despair. If you want to live long, do not only ask what you should eat, ask how you should live. Ask what kind of thoughts you are feeding your mind, what kind of company you keep, what kind of mornings you are creating for yourself. Because one day, if you are fortunate enough, you will wake up at an age that once seemed impossible, and you will realize that survival is not an accident. It is a story you wrote slowly, choice by choice, meal by meal, year by year. If you are ready, I will finish by telling you the one final truth I have learned about reaching the far edge of life and still finding meaning there. So now we arrive at the edge of the story. the place where a man begins to understand that living a long time is not the same thing as living well. I am 98 years old, and every morning I still open my eyes with a small sense of surprise. Not fear, not dread. Just a quiet wonder that the engine inside my chest keeps turning over. I have outlived predictions, outlived trends, outlived many of the rules people once swore were absolute. And if there is one thing I want you to carry away from my voice, it is this. Longevity is not a single decision. It is a pattern of faithfulness repeated across a lifetime. Those 7 foods I spoke about, coffee, berries, fatty fish, eggs, honest red meat, fermented foods, and raw cacao, they were my daily agreements with survival. They were the steady fuel that allowed my body to answer when life called on me. They nourished my brain so I could think clearly when the world grew confusing. They strengthened my blood so I could keep working when comfort would have been easier. They steadied my gut, sharpened my sight, protected my heart in ways I did not fully understand until the years had already proven their wisdom. You may hear arguments about them. You may see studies that praise them one year and question them the next. That is the nature of modern noise. But my evidence has been written slowly in bone and memory, not in headlines. Still, food alone could never explain why I am still here. I have known men who ate carefully but lived carelessly. They poisoned themselves with resentment, with fear, with the constant belief that life had cheated them. A bitter spirit wears down the body like sandpaper on soft wood. I made a different choice. I chose, again and again, to remain engaged with living. I worked while I could. I rested when I must. I forgave people who never asked for forgiveness. I laughed even when my laughter sounded more like a cough. I kept stepping outside to feel the sun on my face, because sunlight reminds a man that time is still moving and that he is still part of it. At this age, you do not pretend to be immortal. You understand that every season is a gift on loan, but you also understand that the human body is far more resilient than most people believe. Treat it with respect, feed it with intention, move it with purpose, and it will often carry you farther than you ever imagined. The goal is not simply to add years to your life. It is to add steadiness to your years, to arrive at old age with your mind still curious, your heart still capable of gratitude, and your hands still willing to reach for the simple rituals that have always sustained you. I sit now by the window most afternoons, watching shadows stretch long across the yard. I drink my coffee slowly. I taste a spoonful of dark cacao and feel that familiar, quiet spark wake up inside me. Some days I remember the boy I once was. Some days I barely recognize him. But I am thankful for both of us. For the reckless young man who worked until his muscles trembled, and for the old man who finally learned the power of consistency. If you are listening to me wherever you are in your own journey, do not wait for perfect knowledge or perfect circumstances. Begin with what is real. Begin with the food on your plate, the air in your lungs, the purpose in your morning. Care for those things faithfully. Do it for years, not weeks. Do it through disappointment and through joy. And one day, if grace allows, you may find yourself sitting where I sit now, still alive, still aware, still grateful for another sunrise. Now, if you will excuse me, it is just about time for my evening walk.